All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Reenter Technical College, and I'm going over a series of video presentations for the Reenter Technical College Application and Web Development AWD1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class. And the main textbook we're going to end up using for the class is ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Mr. Lee Naylor. But I've decided first, because that book is very complex, to go over a series of the chapters in John Galloway of Microsoft and others, Professional ASP.NET MVC 5. I am most of the way through Chapter 4 on models, and I'm up to editing an album. One of the scenarios, the scaffolding handles, is the edit scenario for an album. This begins when the user clicks the edit link. All right, so when I come through here and run the program, I think it is still running. And I click the edit link, notice what happens. It brings up a form, which is, since it's edit, it's pre-populated, but it's even more than that. Notice for genre, we've got our two genres that we created. In our artist ID, we've got our two artists. All right, so we've already got information, and the nice thing about having that information in drop-down lists is it's harder to make mistakes. All right. So when we click the edit on there, it sent an HTTP request to the web server with a URL like this. It said under Store Manager we want to edit, and this, the ID, would be the album. As it says, you can think of this right here as though the system is saying, hey, get me album 5 so I can edit it. The default MVC routing rules deliver the get. All right. You don't need to type this in because it was generated. So let's double check. So here we are. We want to go back to our Store Manager controller, and we want to go back to the details would be it. Actually, we're going to edit. So create, there's edit. All right. So what is it doing? It says first if the ID is null. So if we try to edit something that doesn't exist, we should not be allowed to do that. So it returns this that says it was a bad request. Otherwise, it's going to come in here, and it's going to bring up the album. All right. So let's take a look at what our book says here. So there's all the code. I just showed it to you. As it says here, the edit action has the responsibility of building a model to edit that particular album. It uses the Music Store DB class to retrieve the album and hands the album to the view as the model. It says, but what is the purpose of the 2 lines of code putting data into the view bank? These 2 lines right here. Says these 2 lines might make more sense when you look at a page, the page the user sees when they're editing an album. Because you have only one album, all right, when we go in here to run this, notice it automatically, when we were in edit mode, it said number 1. We only have one album. I mean, if we come through here and put in 5, we get an error message, not found, because it doesn't exist. All right, we don't, with our seed data, we only put in one album. All right. So when the user edits an album, you don't want them to enter freeform text for the genre and artist. Rather, we want them to select what's available from the database. The scaffolding is smart enough to realize this too, because it understands the relationship between the 3 tables. Instead of giving the user a text box to type into, it gives us a drop-down. So when you click this, this is what comes up. Actually, that's the one for the genre ID. The following code, as they mention on the bottom of page 99, is from the Store Manager's Edit View. It's the code that builds the drop-down list. Again, it's using a couple of these HTML helper methods that we will talk about in the next chapter. It says you look at the drop-down list helper in more detail in the next chapter. For now, picture yourself building a drop-down list from scratch. To build the list, you'll need to know what items the list is going to hold. An album model object does not keep all the available genres from the database. It holds only one genre, and that's the one that is associated with the album. The 2 extra lines, as it said, are building the list of every possible artist and every possible genre. All right, storing that information so that you can retrieve it later. The select list is mentioned here on page 100. It's the code that represents the data required to build a drop-down list. The first parameter specifies the items to place in the list. The second parameter is the name of the property containing the value that selects a specific item. The third parameter is the text to display. And I think they should say the fourth parameter contains the value of the initially selected item. So the author says here, remember when the preceding chapter talked about the concept of a view-specific model? The album edit scenario is a good example, where the model object, which is an album, doesn't quite contain all the information required by the view. You need the list of all the possible genres and artists. If we don't have that, all the genres and all the artists, does that exist in an album object? Let's look. All right, remember, an album object, well, I'm going to have to close this, which maybe isn't a good thing, but I will anyway. An album object contains what? This information. But it also has access to this information, which is what we're going to need. We need the list of all possible genres and artists. As the author says in the text here, there are 2 ways that we can solve this situation. The scaffolding generated code demonstrates the first option. Pass the extra information along with a view bag structure. This is entirely reasonable and easy to implement, but some people want all the model data to be available during using a strongly typed object. It says the strongly typed fans will look to the second object. Build a view-specific model to carry both the album information and the genre and artist information to a view that might look something like this. So rather than putting it into the view bag, as it says, the edit would instantiate this model, set the properties accordingly, and pass the model to the view. All right. Now, the author says one approach isn't necessarily better than the other. You have to kind of pick and choose based on what you want to do, what the people you're working with want to do, etc. The only thing I would add to that is remember that with view bag, it's this kind of magical bag that'll hold anything. And it's a big bag and it can increase, but you shouldn't try to stuff the entire world into it. So if you start putting too much stuff in, you'd probably want to go with the second option. All right. The edit view on the bottom of page 100 and going on to page 101 says the following code isn't exactly what's in the edit view, but it represents the essence of what's in there. See it between here and here. It says this view, basically it includes a form with a variety of inputs for the user to enter information. Some of the inputs are drop-down lists, like the genre ID. Others are text box controls, like the title and the price. All right, so it says basically what it's doing is something similar to this if we were writing it in straight HTML. All right, the HTML there sends an HTTP post request back, but when does it do that? When does it do post? When the user has made a change and has clicked on the submit button, or save button in this case. The browser automatically connects all the information a user enters into the form. Sorry. Well, that didn't look good. Should have had stuff here. Let's double check this. Hold on for just a second, please. All right. So as it says here, doing this, the HTML sends a post request back, all right, when the user clicks the Save button on the page. The browser automatically collects the associated information that gets entered into the form and sends the values, along with their names, with the request. Notice the name of the attributes in the input and select. They match the property names in the album model. It says you will see why this naming is significant shortly. All right. So the action of accepting the post request also has the name edit, but is differentiated because it has this up here. Now the other one may or may not, you know, when you go up into this, may or may not have, I don't even know if it's shown here. Probably not. See, that's a get. They could have had in brackets there HTTP get in the same way that here on page 101 they have HTTP post right there. So the post request to edit album information, again, also has the name edit. It's differentiated because it's got that designation there, HTTP post. The responsibility, as they mention on the next page, the responsibility of this action is to accept an album model with all the user's edits inside and save the object to the database. You may be wondering how the updated album object appears as a parameter to the action. This comes in the next section. For now, let's focus on what's happening inside of the action itself. Well, I don't know if this is a real term or if it's something the author came up with on 102, but the author here talks about an edit happy path and an edit sad path. The happy path is when everything goes the way you want it to go. In other words, when you filled up the information that was in the edit, you didn't break any rules. It asked for a price and you put a number in there, things like that. All right. An action can check the validity of a model object by checking the model state.isValid property. They do mention this a little bit more later in the chapter, but it's more the subject of Chapter 6, because Chapter 6 is on data annotations, where we learn how to add validation rules to the model. As it says, for right now, think of model state.isValid as a signal to ensure the user entered usable data. All right. If the model is in a valid state, the edit action executes that line of code. This line tells the data context about an object whose values already live in the database. Not a brand new album, but it's an existing album. So we want to do a modified here, not an insert. All right. After we do this, the next line of code that's in here does the db.save changes. All right. And that invokes the save changes on the data context. So it's telling it to do an update. Now we also have a sad path that's shown here on the bottom of 102. All right. And as the author says, the sad path is the path the action takes if the model is invalid. Here are the controllers, so it's kind of like the, I don't know what you call it, the else of the if here. So if it's valid, this is what you want to do. Otherwise, that's the sad path code right there. So for example, if in the price you put a non-numeric value or you left it blank, the model state wouldn't be valid. So in that case, the action rebuilds the list boxes and it asks the user, for lack of better words, all right, to re-enter. It doesn't physically say that, but it takes them back to where they were. And the author says here, you are probably wondering how the error message appears. In Chapter 6, we'll cover it in depth. For now, it says you want to understand how this edit action receives an album object with the user's data values inside. The process behind this is the magic of model binding. And model binding, so you can see it automatically gave us that error message. And that has to do with model binding, which starts on the bottom of page 103, and it is the last, I don't know, about the last 5 pages of the chapter. So I think I'll finish that one up in a last presentation in just a few minutes.